We're starting out with music therapy today. Hope you can hear the lyrics. How could anyone have told you you were anything less than beautiful? How could anyone ever tell you you were less than whole? How could anyone fail to notice that your loving is a miracle? How deeply you're connected to my soul. How could anyone ever tell you you were anything less than beautiful? How could anyone ever tell you you were less than whole? How could anyone fail to notice that your loving is a miracle? How deeply you're connected to my soul. It's a beautiful song, thanks to onsiteworkshops.org, where I did my codependency treatment. They introduced me to that song there, and when I heard it for the first probably 50 times, 20 times, it would make me weep, and it still touches my heart and opens my heart, and that's what music therapy does. And I'm sure you have your own songs that remind you of either empowerment or tenderness or sweetness or strength. But anyway, art and music therapy are really important and very helpful. So today we are talking about chronic PTSD. Had to grab my notes there. And let me just tell you first the difference between complex PTSD and PTSD, regular PTSD. This diagnosis, PTSD, was originally intended for combat veterans and soldiers who came back and had one episode that was very, very intense and changed their lives and really made them have difficulty functioning. So there were, or death, torture, imprisonment. PTSD usually refers to the episode that causes the stress, and it's usually severe stress, and was expanded to include 3 types of PTSD. Type A or type 1 is one episode of a traumatic episode that affects your life. Type B or type 2 PTSD is prolonged chronic exposure. Direct trauma is you experience, for example, a rape or some abuse. And then indirect or tertiary trauma is when you either witnessed it or had to be there when it happened, or like a therapist or a nurse or a doctor in crisis situations, you had to hear about it and be a part of it. So there is that secondary trauma, which is why we talk so much about self-care for therapists and other people that are in the healthcare field. C-PTSD is complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and it really refers to the ongoing and intense exposure of some sort of trauma. And let me just read you what they say. It is defined as a psychological injury that results from prolonged exposure to social or interpersonal trauma, disempowerment, captivity, or entrapment with lack or loss of viable escape route for the victim. So a child who can't stop having to watch the parents when they're fighting, or some physical abuse, domestic battering, of course, ongoing domestic battering for the wife or the children. And I'm going to cover a little bit more about the abuse in a minute. One layer of trauma after another interacts with one another. So the complex PTSD is that just talking about one event may still leave you feeling sort of overwhelmed and traumatized, because you have to look at how these traumas interact with each other and look at this as a complex experience and requires complex treatment. It is the traumatic events and exposure all together, how long you were there. This reminds me of complex grief also, like when I lost 4 people in a space of 18 months. I was extremely depressed and had experienced a severe major depressive episode, which I'd never really experienced before throughout my recovery. So that major episode was due to my brain not, even though I processed my brother's death in therapy 9 years afterwards, these 4 deaths within a span of 18 months make the coping much more difficult, and the period to getting over it much longer. So just like losing your spouse or a child, you're going to have a different sort of recovery route than other people who have lost a friend or a mentor or something like that. This information has been borrowed from www, get out a pen and paper, outofthefog.net /common non-behaviors /CPTSD. Now, all you really need to know is outofthefog.net. And you can go there, and the resources are incredible, and some of it's very clinical, so take your time reading it, but really to learn about and understand your situations and what happened to you is the first step towards healing. So there's 15 characteristics that are really delved into very deeply that create traumatic stress, and all we're going to do today is name those, because I want to go into some other aspects of CPTSD. So this is what can cause CPTSD. 1, domestic, emotional, physical, sexual abuse. 2, childhood, emotional, physical, sexual abuse. Now, there is I don't know if this term is used much anymore, but one is called pansexual abuse. There's another form, sort of psychological sexual abuse, and that's being exposed. Let's say you're exposed to porn, but that was the only thing that happened to you and you were at a very young age. You're going to have some issues with sexuality later on. Maybe this is not incest or physical sexual abuse, but it's like pansexual abuse. It covers a whole area of sexual development when it's introduced too early. So emotional incest is when a child, and this happened to me with my mother and probably with some other siblings, but my mother would confide in me about her feelings and her issues, especially her anger and disappointment with my father. And if I tried, and you may have heard this in my other videos, if I tried to stand up for myself, I was rejected, and the wrath of her fury was exposed. So I really learned to just listen to her and hold all my feelings inside. That caused me to have complex PTSD, even though it wasn't some of these other issues. It was emotional abuse and a form of emotional incest, because she was getting her needs met, but I wasn't getting my needs met. There were times when I was extremely upset when she did meet my needs, and it wasn't always like that, but it's the episodes and those long periods of time when the episodes continued of me not getting my needs met that led me to have drug problem and other problems, and we'll get into that later. So the other causes of CPTSD: entrapment or kidnapping, slavery or enforced labor like trafficking of children or trafficking of adults in prostitution, long-term imprisonment and torture, repeated violations of personal boundaries. Now again, we're talking about layers and layers of trauma, not just one episode. Long-term objectification, and I'm going to talk about that in some later videos. It's very intense and has a lot to it. Gaslighting, we're going to go into that in detail later also. False accusations or distortion campaigns. So sometimes that means going outside the family or outside the workplace and talking to other people and doing a smear campaign where the other person is described as this horrible person. And many times batterers will do that, and the victim is left without any help or support because the batterer can be very charming. Push-pull, when the batterer or the abuser pulls you back into them with love bombs or with appreciation or worship. But then, of course, it's always eventually followed by abuse, whether it's physical, emotional, or psychological abuse. So push and pull. Splitting means all persons are either all good or all bad. There's no gray in between. So you can't just be okay if you have a fight. You're a bad person, and there may be name calling, put downs, excess criticism. There's no gray. And like Trump says, either you're for me or against. I don't think this is his quote, but it's to him, it's like you're either for me or against me. Yes, I know, and I'm not into politics. I don't care who you vote for. Rage, impulsive aggression. Impulsive aggression, rage, is when the batterer or the predator or the abuser has episodes of absolute rage where they can tear things apart, really be a threat to safety of the children and of the partner. So some people with mental illness can have these impulsive rage episodes, and that's especially if you have to have experienced or been a part of many of those, you're going to have C-PTSD. Hovering, which is something we'll talk about later, and emotional boundary violations. So the need and exploring we will do later, and I want to tell you now what it feels like to have C-PTSD. Again, this is directly out of the outofthefog.net. What it feels like. People who suffer from C-PTSD may feel uncentered and shaky, as if they are likely to have an embarrassing emotional breakdown or burst into tears at any moment. They may feel unloved or that nothing they can accomplish is ever going to be good enough for others. People who suffer from C-PTSD may feel compelled to get away from others and be by themselves so that no one will witness what may come next with them. They may feel afraid to form close friendships to prevent possible loss should another catastrophe strike. Those who suffer from C-PTSD may feel that everything is about to go out of the window, and they have to be hypervigilant and careful and wait for the next shoe to drop, and that they will not be able to handle even the simplest tasks. They may be too distracted by what is going on at home to focus on being successful at school or in the workplace. And C-PTSD can affect success, where the person can be so overwhelmed that success may feel difficult and untenable. Some more C-PTSD characteristics of how it can manifest in victims over time. And remember the videos on the defenses that I talked about when I did defenses and feelings, and then I did a deep dive into defenses. Those videos may be helpful for you to look at the early stages of this. How can it manifest in the victims over time? Number one, rage turned inward. Addictions like I had, eating disorders, depression, alcoholism, truancy, dropping out. Now, it took me 5 years to get through college. Now, part of that's because I have a learning disability, and part of it is because I was partying so hard, and to get to the end of that time felt impossible to me, not because I don't have an above average IQ, but probably because it just didn't feel like I deserved it and couldn't seem to get there, but I did. Number two, promiscuity, codependence, doormat syndrome, which is choosing poor partners, trying to please someone who can never be pleased, trying to resolve the primal relationship. Now, one of my ways of having that codependency in relationships was for a long time to choose partners that I knew I would not be in love with, and they were men who somehow were below me economically, emotionally, psychologically, somehow out of my league, which I chose on purpose, someone that needed help so I wouldn't have to be in love with them. And I did the opposite. I had one experience, the first love of my life, where I had that codependent relationship and wanted their approval and was addicted to him and needy, needy, needy. And after that, I'm sure that's when I decided to take my mother's route and hate men and take advantage of the men who cared about me. So rage turned outward, theft, destruction of property, becoming a control freak, violence. I know at one time I stole something and I did actually mail it back because I felt so guilty. But I did remember thinking it would be interesting to do this, and I'm sure it was related to these characteristics. Other characteristics: learned hypervigilance, always looking for the next shoe to drop, what's going to happen next, scanning the environment, sitting by the door or at the back of the restaurant to be sure you can be safe, looking at other people's feelings and thoughts and trying to assess them and make sure that they're safe, those kinds of things. Or a clouded perception or blinders about others, especially romantic partners. So seeking these partners, either not your equal psychologically, or feeling like you're beneath them and you're dependent on them so that you can either control them or be controlled by them. Danger can happen with battered women who do not notice the danger signs because they have this C-PTSD, and the relationship starts to give these little signs, but they don't pick up on them because of the C-PTSD and how used they are to it, and how that part of their brain is not functioning as well because of the long-term abuse that went on in childhood. Seeking positions of power and or control. I know I've seen, like myself, lots of survivors of CPTSD who go into the healthcare field, especially some that had a lot of trauma, who do EMT work, emergency surgery doctors, high excitement and adrenaline, just like they grew up with in their families. So then they feel like they can control that situation and have power over it. Of course, they can't. They're usually re-traumatizing themselves and need to do that healing and then choose to stay in that field, which you can do if you want. Choosing occupations or recreational outlets that would put oneself in physical danger, or choosing to become a fixer, therapist, mediator, etc., which is what I talked about, nurse, doctor. Now, I noticed when I was still using that I would know that a situation was a little bit dangerous, but I felt like I could handle it. And of course, being on drugs, I couldn't handle it. But I remember getting in situations that were actually pretty scary. One time I had to take a bus in Atlanta at like 12 midnight by myself. No one was on the bus, going through these bad neighborhoods. And at that time I was scared though. So usually when I was clean then, but when I was using, I wouldn't even be afraid. So the judgment was totally off. And some of that is to relate to that anger we develop as a kid when we're in CPTSD. Avoidance, withdrawing from relationships, as we mentioned earlier, blaming, identifying a person or people responsible and complaining about them, but not doing anything about the problem. Yes, at some point you have to look at the trauma and what happened, and that is taking responsibility to see what happened to you and have your feelings about that so that you can do something about the adult trauma that you're involved in instead of blaming. Catastrophizing. This is the habit of automatically assuming a worst case scenario and inappropriately characterizing minor or moderate problems or issues as catastrophic events. This is still something that I do, although on a minimal basis compared to in the past. But when I would have an issue, there were two female supervisors that I had that were very similar to my mother. And when there was an instance or an episode with them where I thought they were upset with me, I could spend 3 days having anxiety attacks, obsessing, trying to figure it out, thinking about all the things that I had done. And this went on for a number of years, probably 5 years before I healed that aspect of my trauma. Being in those relationships was a repetition of the trauma. And I remember a couple of people telling me, you're involved in this relationship and it's really not good for you. I could not extract myself, and that's part of the CPTSD. As a victim, you don't see a way out. Now, there were ways out, which I discovered later, but not when I was at that stage of CPTSD. Control me syndrome describes a tendency that some people have to better relationships. And this is maybe a little bit of what I was talking about. Some people have to foster relationships with people who have a controlling, narcissistic, antisocial, or acting out nature. Now, I would have been the narcissistic, acting out person. I think anybody with a drug problem, because it's so pathological to get into drugs and to be involved in the drug community, that there definitely is narcissistic traits and tendencies. Now, bipolar, and my mom had bipolar traits, so she would have some of those narcissistic tendencies. Bipolars are not necessarily narcissistic personality disorders, but they can have that exact same sort of issue. So again, acting out, antisocial, or narcissistic personality disorders, other mental illnesses, other addictions, those sorts of things that if kids live in that family and situation, they're going to have a hard time coping with that trauma later as an adult. Denial. Denial is believing or imagining that some factual reality, circumstance, feeling, or memory does not exist or did not happen. Everyone in the beginning has a little bit or a lot of denial. My family was definitely had great difficulty over my brother's death, my mom not knowing how to cope with her emotions. And the first thing I said, you may have heard me say this before, when I went to my first therapist appointment, she said, well, tell me about your family. And I said, well, I came from a very normal family and didn't think a word of it until I had enough therapy to see exactly what had happened. Again, you can't heal it if you can't see it. And it's not about blaming, it's about facing reality, not living in denial. Depression, non-PD, depression of a non-personality disorder person. Depression is when you feel sadder than your circumstances dictate. So on those weekends when I would have those episodes of shame and guilt related to these two supervisors, I would also have this depression. And it was a larger depression than the situations really called for longer than your circumstances last, 3 days obsessing about it, but still can't seem to break out of it. It took a lot for me to learn how to break out of it without a lot more recovery and therapy. Escape to fantasy. Fear of abandonment. Fear of abandonment and irrational jealousy is a phobia, sometimes exhibited by people with personality disorders, that they are in imminent danger of being rejected, discarded, or replaced at the whim of a person who is close to them. And really, many times, a person with a personality disorder will not display this absolute terror they have at fear of abandonment. They will express anger and rage instead, and criticism, and the things that cause CPTSD. Hypervigilance, we talked about that. Identity disturbances. Most of us could say that our image of ourselves before we got healthy was a very inconsistent self-view. Other people saw me differently than I saw myself. Vulnerability in my family was sort of seen as a weakness. So one of the things that I did to cover up that vulnerability was to be mean and blunt and hypercritical. And that is one of the ways to cover up that identity. So when you take that away, whatever identity, a codependent identity, a caretaker identity, a superhero, overachiever identity, then you're left with a feeling of nakedness, vulnerability, and shame. And that is when you can begin to build back up. Now, that's not in the early stages of therapy. That's probably in the middle stages of therapy. So the next page talks about learned helplessness. And when you work with, if you've ever been around domestic violence, the victims definitely have some learned helplessness, just like the rat who they put in a maze and they have little doors around them, or an elephant who was chained up since being a baby. When they take the chains off and they're adult, the elephant never moves away from the length of the chain because they have this learned helplessness and they can't get out of it and can't get away from it. And that's what happens in battering and in physical, sexual, and emotional psychological abuse. Low self-esteem. Low self-esteem is a common name for negatively distorted self-view, which is inconsistent with reality. So I love that saying. It is inconsistent with reality, your negative self-view. People who have low self-esteem see themselves as unworthy of being successful in personal and professional settings and in social relationships. They may view their successes and their strengths in a negative light and believe that others see them in the same way. As a result, they may develop an avoidance strategy to protect themselves from criticism. One of the ways I had to struggle with that when I was at the height of my career in Atlanta, and I was doing individual therapy, group therapy, radio show, and I would do workshops in the same type of workshops that I had attended for my healing, and that I then helped put on these workshops as a therapist. And so I did my very first weekend workshop, and as I was driving, I was late, number one, sabotage, and number two, I was going up this street and I had to take a U-turn up in the distance, and I didn't know how far away it was. Okay, poor decision making. So I decided to cross this ravine where there was no road, no street, nothing. Within a few feet of getting down this little hill, I was stuck. There was absolutely no way I could get out. That is total sabotage. I should have, even though I was late, I should have gone straight up the street and taken the other road instead of gone into the ravine. Instantly, somebody drove by and towed me out. So to me, that was sort of a miraculous experience, which has happened so many times when I've really, really wanted to succeed and break one of these old patterns. And if you really, really want to, somehow something will happen that will allow you to do that usually. I had the same experience with taking a long time to graduate in college. Same thing, same sabotage, but worse because I was on drugs. So these tendencies don't all go away immediately. They go away, in my experience, when I did extremely intense psychotherapy, I would have big changes in behavior. And then there still is residual tiny little changes in behavior that I would have later, like driving into the ravine, like not finishing college, taking as long as I could to finish my graduate degree. Those kinds of things were the smaller little unhealed behaviors that I had to look at. Tunnel vision, the habit or tendency to only see or focus on a single priority while neglecting or ignoring other important priorities. So that says what it is. Self-loathing and extreme self-hatred of one's own self, actions, or one's ethnic or demographic background. And that is the experience of shame. It must be my fault. Selective memory and selective amnesia. That tells you what that is. Perfectionism, the practice of holding oneself to an unrealistic, unsustainable, or unattainable standard of organization, order, or accomplishment in one particular area of living, while sometimes neglecting common standards of organization, order, or accomplishment in others. C-PTSD, again, is caused by a prolonged or sustained exposure to emotional trauma, abuse from which no short-term means of escape is available or apparent to the victim. Now, the treatment for C-PTSD is, number one, as an adult, well, as if you're a parent of children and they're in a traumatic experience. Also, removal of and protection from the source of the trauma and or abuse, getting away from the batterer. Most women who leave, 70% of women who leave a domestic violence situation are killed when they try to leave or leave. So don't ask why'd she stay, ask how could he do that. So that's why she stayed. But we need to remove and protect from the source of trauma and or abuse. And again, for domestic violence, along with 70% being murdered, many times you'll get them in therapy, and they usually have an average of returning back to the batterer 3 times. And again, part of that is that trauma bond through CPTSD. 2, acknowledge the trauma as real, important, and undeserved. Now, this takes a couple of years when you're working on it very intensely. Acknowledge that the trauma came from something that was stronger than the victims and therefore could not be avoided. So blaming ourselves and shaming ourselves, learning that this was something stronger than as a victim. When I work with clients, one of the things I have them take a look at is, if this were happening to your daughter and she said she really felt like she had caused it, what would you say to her? Instantly, they will tell me it's not her fault, she shouldn't be feeling that way, blah, blah, blah. And then we go back to looking at them as a child, and why is it you can't say that to yourself? Why is it you see that little girl as being responsible and causing this? And then there is a whole reparative process that happens with that. It's called inner child work, and it's middle stage and late stage therapy, and it's repair work, and it is very intense, and many times will leave you, one episode of that type of treatment can leave you really changed in your life forever in many ways. That was my experience anyway. And I had to go through several of them and then wait times in between for other little behavioral healings. Acknowledge the complex nature of PTSD. The responses to earlier traumas may have led to decisions that brought on additional undeserved trauma, like me being out at midnight in the middle of Atlanta streets by myself. Acknowledgement that recovery from the trauma is not trivial and will require significant time and effort. So many people choose not to do trauma therapy, and they don't have to. Sometimes you want to do brief therapy, and that's your choice, and that's okay. But we're really talking about people that want to do extended treatment for their trauma, especially CPTSD, which can be healed. Separation of residual problems into those that the victim can resolve, such as personal improvement goals, letting them resolve little goals at a time so they can begin to build their self-esteem. Those that the victim can resolve, such as the behavior of a disordered family member. That might be kind of large goal in the beginning, but you can work up to that. Mourning for what has been lost and cannot be recovered. When you finally accept that the situation you're in will not change at all, you go through a mourning process that is difficult. But again, for me, I would go through it again to be the person I was when I came out of it. Program of recovery with focus on what can be improved in an individual's life that is under their own control. Group therapy is very helpful for that. Placement in a supportive environment where the victim can discover they are not alone and can receive validation for their successors and support through their struggles. Support groups, 12-step groups, therapy groups, all of those, a combination of those are extremely helpful and can achieve that. As necessary, personal therapy to promote self-discovery and, for me, healing of different incidents and emotions and episodes. As required, prescription of antidepressant medication. My clients who are in the beginning, traumatic history clients, in the beginning, many of them do much better if they're on an antidepressant because it keeps them from having that depression that overwhelms them and they can't change. And sometimes they can go off of it at a certain point. And what to do about CPTSD if you've got it. Remove yourself from the primary or situation or secondary situation stemming from the primary abuse. Seek therapy, talk about it, write about it, meditation, medication if needed, physical exercise, rewrite the script in your life. Inner child work, I've added to this. Identify your core beliefs, add positive mantras, add spirituality, and I believe in art therapy and music therapy and experiential therapy, which is role play, gestalt, and acting it out. And that's where, when you're ready, that's where you can have an episode that is healed, and it will seem to take out like 3 or 4 other memories with it, and you don't have to work on those, because if you can work on the earliest one, sometimes it will take several of them out with that memory itself. So I hope this has been helpful to you to identify whether or not you have C-PTSD, and stay tuned for the next 2 videos. We'll cover how the abuser makes you crazy and sets you up for a trauma bond and makes it impossible to get out of the relationship. Okay? All right, look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks so much. This is Susie Marshall, CSW, on my YouTube channel, and I will see you again. Thanks. Bye.